The U.S. State Department has approved the sale of ERAM missiles to Ukraine. What are their specifications? How dangerous are they for the enemy? And will they become a game changer in the war? Friends, you are on the YouTube channel Ukraine Today. This is the main news. Don't forget to subscribe and like this episode. Today we are also discussing how Ukrainian forces destroyed the infrastructure of the key railway station Tver. Russian Orel is also being attacked by drones. Russians are reporting explosions and a fire. And in the Bryansk region, Ukrainian defense forces struck a fuel pumping station on the main oil product pipelines. A Ukrainian drone also caused a fire in the forest near Putin's palace in Gelendzhik. All the details are in the segment following this discussion.
The U.S. State Department has approved the sale of more than 3,000 ERAM cruise missiles to Ukraine. They can be launched from F-16, MiG-29 and Su-27 aircraft. Their range is 450 to 460 kilometers.
Right now, I have a normal relationship with Zelensky, but it's completely different from before because we no longer give money to Ukraine. We're making money. Here's what's happening. NATO is buying all the necessary weapons and paying for them. But even so, I want to stop the war.
If the Russian Federation tries to torpedo the efforts of the United States at the moment of ending the war in Ukraine, then accordingly the Ukrainian side will receive approval from both the President of the United States and consequently the Pentagon to use these strike assets against the territory of the Russian Federation.
Ukrainian intelligence operatives used an FPV drone for the first time to strike a ship carrying Kaliber missiles.
We're talking about a strike on a carrier of Kaluga cruise missiles. This is the Project 21631 Bayan M. What's special about it? The point was that Goer drones hit moving targets. So this is an unprecedented case. Once again, the strike hit the ship's radar. This significantly reduces the overall capabilities of this particular cruise missile carrier at the present moment, both in terms of effectively countering incoming drones and accordingly launching the cruise missiles themselves with full operational capacity.
The Russian Orel was attacked by drones. The video shows explosions and a fire. According to local authorities, an apartment building and several cars were damaged.
What the H? Repeatedly, when the Russian air defense system, particularly the advanced Pantsir S-1 missile system, attempted to intercept an incoming Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicle, UAV, it regrettably ended up striking and causing significant damage to residential buildings in various locations, specifically in Belgorod, within the bustling city of Moscow itself, and across the broader Moscow region. This unfortunate pattern of collateral damage has raised considerable concerns regarding the precision and effectiveness of these defense operations in densely populated urban areas. So this is already, a sad statistic of Russian air defense actions when it comes to striking their own residential infrastructure.
The drone debris caused a fire in the forest just 10 kilometers from Putin's palace in Gelendzhik. Because of the fear of drone attacks, Putin has almost completely stopped flying to his residence in Sochi.
You don't live my life, and you don't understand what security issues are like. It's just that when a person is far removed from this, they simply don't notice it.
The Russian air defense system is so-called localized in nature. That is, the main resources are directed toward protecting either Moscow, the Moscow region, or accordingly Putin's residences, both in Altai and likewise in Gelendzhik. When several dozen UAVs are launched, some of them are indeed neutralized by Russian air defense, but more than 40%, and according to experts, even more than 60% reach their targets.
Ukrainian defenders destroyed an MTLB armored tractor in the Pokrovsk direction. The number of such vehicles among the Russians is rapidly decreasing since they were produced exclusively at the Kharkiv tractor plant. The infrastructure of the key railway station Tver was also destroyed.
This concerns the blocking of supplies of petroleum products, personnel, and heavy armored vehicles that will be used directly on the front line, both on Russian territory, specifically in the Kursk region, and on Ukrainian territory. It should be noted that this is not the first strike on Tver.
Russian diplomacy is targeting the fortified belt from Kostiantynivka to Kramatorsk, the last important line of defense in the Donbas. But the Ukrainian Armed Forces do not believe that as a result of negotiations, they will be ordered to retreat.
The Russian Federation fully understands that it is practically impossible to storm these four cities, Bryansk, Kramatorsk, and the agglomeration, neither in the near future nor in the more distant historical perspective. According to assessments by both British intelligence and the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, It would take the Russian Federation at least 4 to 5 years to achieve this. That is why the occupiers are trying to push the theory of either so-called territorial exchanges or proposals like these for the creation of a so-called buffer or neutral zone.
It is obvious that the Russians are unable to achieve the results they want by military means, and no one will agree to give up territory at the negotiating table. But Putin doesn't seem to care much about this and is still willing to fight at the cost of destroying Russia itself.
Let's discuss all this further with Igor Romanenko. We are joined by a retired Lieutenant General, candidate of military sciences, Doctor of Technical Sciences, Deputy Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine in 2006 to 10. Igor Alexandrovich, hello. I'm very glad to see you.
Thank you likewise. Greetings to our viewers.
Igor Alexandrovich, let's start with something pleasant after all. In just the last 4 or 5 days, the armed forces of Ukraine have managed to significantly thin out Russian air defense systems, thereby opening the way, as I understand it, for at least drone strikes. And in the past 2 weeks, according to various estimates, up to 22% of Russian oil refining capacity has already been put out of commission. You know, as an ordinary person, it feels like we already have IRAM and the flamingos are flying out really powerfully, and the long-range Neptune isn't just sitting somewhere in storage. How do you explain such sudden effectiveness and success?
First of all, I would like us to stay closer to the objective situation. The reality is that missile programs like the long-range Neptune, Flamingo, and Sapsan have indeed undergone combat testing. In other words, they have proven their capabilities. And now the scaling stage is underway, meaning efforts are being made to mass produce and launch production, which in the context of such a large-scale war is a very complex and difficult process. That is, most of our programs that have been mentioned, and in fact, we've had a missile program since 2022 with various projects. Not all of it has been revealed or implemented yet, but it is expected to gain momentum by the end of the year. That's why, of course, we still need other missiles, and we've been requesting the F-16s as well. But the deliveries, which just in case were delayed by the Americans for a whole year, are still pending. So that it's not just the aircraft themselves with their modest air-to-air missile capabilities of up to 120 kilometers, but would provide aviation equipment and weaponry with a range of at least up to 300 kilometers, well, up to 300 kilometers, JASSM, for example. And the Americans are not providing that. However, just recently, Trump explained all this, saying that the Europeans are paying now, and now they're ready. It wasn't like that before. And if it was before, then everything is clear. Next, according to the algorithm, which says one way or another, these IRAM missiles can have a range of 400 and 240 kilometers. As always, the question arises, which one will they provide us with? Will they transfer to us? But the point is, these are still foreign missiles, especially American ones, so you have to decide whether to strike this or not strike that, and so on. That's why, of course, we appreciate our European allies who are paying, and the Americans are still going along with this and supplying them. But what we need are capabilities, not limitations. We need to keep this in mind right from the start, and that's why having our own is always more effective, more important. That's it. And that's why it's necessary to develop these missile directions across a broad spectrum in all these areas.
Understood. Well, as they say, the right thing at the right time is what matters. Yes, but perhaps it's already a bit late for us to receive these ERAMs. And you are absolutely right. The whole issue here is the restrictions on their use. Because we remember how the US presidential administration restricted us, even those same strikes on oil pipelines and refineries, we could have carried them out a year or a year and a half ago, probably with the same success. But our hands were tied.
And as is well known, yes, as is well known, even now, to put it mildly, they do not welcome strikes on these targets. In fact, they would prefer that they didn't happen at all. So, when Trump was informed about this latest massive strike, he said, yes, I know. But the Ukrainians are hitting, energy, everything related to fuel and lubricants, production, storage, and supply. Well, that's one point of view.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
But that's a very cynical comparison, of course, yes, and a cynical policy towards Ukrainians. Igor Alexandrovich, but here I can't help but ask a question that has become pressing in society right now. Isn't it time to respond in kind to the terror against the civilian population of Ukraine? Because fighting terrorism is extremely difficult and practically impossible, especially with such rampant terrorism, right? Diplomacy doesn't work there, persuasion doesn't work there. And Russia, as we well understand, only understands strength and arguments based on fear, which need to be sown there. In your opinion, does Ukraine even have the moral right to carry out similar actions against the Russian Federation?
Ukraine has had the right to do all this since back in 2014. The whole question is how to implement it. Ukraine's defense forces need the tools to implement such an approach. This is fundamental from a military, political, diplomatic, and if you like, an all-encompassing perspective. That's it. But the states, together with our allies, must provide the opportunities and tools to Ukraine's defense forces to make this happen. It is necessary to increase the potential of Ukraine's defense forces, essentially to provide the appropriate amount of weapons, equipment, and ammunition so that this can happen. This is, of course, the main issue. And only then comes the matter that we discussed. If the weapons belong to the allies, all these regulations begin. But here, war is war, and it has its own laws, objective laws. If you give here, take there, and impose restrictions elsewhere, it's very difficult to be effective under such conditions.
It's understandable that such questions arise in society after the bloody and terrifying strikes that Putin recently carried out on the capital of Ukraine. But other cities are suffering as well. The capital is no exception. What conclusions can we draw after the latest missile strike? There are a lot of questions right now, in particular, why did the ballistic missiles become invisible to Ukrainian air defense systems this time? What tactics is the enemy using? And well, how did the Ukrainian air defense forces perform? How successful were they?
So we need to keep in mind here that, well, in terms of timing, this massive strike happened after the diplomatic missions that were here had left. During this critical period of time, they technically managed to successfully accumulate a certain considerable number of various missiles, numerous drones, and in general, diverse means of aerial attack. And Putin demonstrated, let's say, an approach that shows he is not giving up on conducting military operations. But if Trump behaves this way, he doesn't stop or condemn, doesn't put any pressure on Putin, then Putin takes full advantage of this opportunity, and this time because he understands that one way or another, the window of opportunity for continuing military actions might, after all, be closing. And in this regard, he's making massive use of it. Such opportunities exist. Here we see the manifestation of this component, especially if you add the most powerful, the fastest ballistic missiles. So he focused specifically on this, especially since obviously he was informed that their capabilities had been improved. So their flight trajectories were made ballistic, which at that time meant they would rise very high and then strike the target almost vertically downward. Now this trajectory has changed. It has become more flat, skimming just above the surface. And this means that detecting them has become much more difficult. Previously, cruise missiles used to fly at considerable altitudes, but now the ballistic missiles move quickly, and since we don't have many anti-missile systems, especially anti-ballistic ones like the Patriot batteries, of which we have few, all of this has come together. And as events unfolded, those who observed how they were flying, what was being destroyed along the way, noted that they were even being tracked, detected, and accompanied. And if that's the case, then naturally there are questions about their destruction. That's why, as you can see, the enemy is trying to make their strikes more effective, not only by increasing their numbers, but also take the last strike, for example, which was a bit weaker than the maximum, the record one, where 740 aerial attack assets were used, as we remember, including up to 50 missiles and up to 500 attack drones. But this time there were far more drones. That's the situation. So the conclusion here is the enemy is improving, and we need to increase the potential of our air and missile defense. Leadership, this is in fact a matter for our top military and political leadership, and we are trying to focus the appropriate efforts here. But as was previously announced, those 17 batteries, we remember this from Trump. So there's this slogan, where are those 17 batteries? The question is, when it came to practical implementation, when it moved into the practical realm, it turned out that the main deliveries would be sometime next spring. And maybe, well, basically, whenever it comes to future prospects, we realize that we needed them yesterday. They talk about this as something for a bright future, and that's why the struggle continues here. And of course, when all technical possibilities are used to increase the potential of our air defense, as well as organizational measures which involve local communities in organizing this defense, it means that communities are being engaged. Well, the main thing is that the servicemen from these communities will be trained and given opportunities. Such decisions have been made by the government. However, there is a long way from decision to implementation, because people need to be trained, and even those who agree, meaning that citizens who are not subject to mobilization will be involved. That in itself is a separate issue. That's why it's quite difficult because of this, but we need to use every possible way to strengthen our air and missile defense.
We could really use a couple more webs, wouldn't you agree? That would make Ukrainian citizens even safer. Look, the results of the web system are clear. We no longer see dozens of fighter jets flying in and launching their missiles like at the beginning of the war. We've seen a significant reduction in the use of military aviation in attacks on Ukraine.
As for strategic long-range aviation, after the significant introduction of the web system, their overall activity has been effectively cut in half, a considerable reduction. But there's a nuance here. During the last strike, there were no caliber missiles used, because at that time, as we've already mentioned, the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense had carried out a drone attack on their ship, which is a carrier of caliber missiles. And possibly they decided they needed to relocate. So for one, caliber missiles were not used in the last strike. Secondly, those that were loaded with missiles, including the strategic long-range aviation aircraft, only half of them were deployed. So this is a serious issue. Our citizens need to keep this in mind. So they used half of the air-based carriers from strategic and long-range aviation. That means Kh-101 missiles. And half remain loaded, which means another massive strike is being prepared. And since there was a certain pause, they are ready to carry it out. After the previous one, they need about, 3 days. And now that period is coming to an end. What I mean is that once again, Putin's peacekeeping approaches might be connected to the period from September 1st to 4th, related to his meeting there in China, and so on. It's possible that during this time he won't, so to speak, launch any strikes. Therefore, again, since everything is ready, it could happen before the 1st. We need to stay vigilant, especially since we can see the consequences of massive strikes, judging by the most recent ones. And of course, we need to focus on strengthening our defenses. It would be great if those RAM missiles could be delivered as soon as possible, because the most effective way to counter anything is to act preemptively. That's why it's important to strike at locations where, for example, Iskander launchers are stationed, as well as tactical aviation assets. Hit those airfields, strike them, and for many other reasons as well. If only we had the tools with a range of 460 kilometers, not just 240. We do need the 240 as well, but 460 is the priority so that we can reach enemy military targets as far away as possible.
You're absolutely right, but something tells me that until flamingos start taking off in flocks, we won't achieve that result. Because, it really feels like, don't you get the impression that the US, following its long-standing historical tradition, and many of our European partners too, let's be honest, are in a way saving Putin from a total defeat in this war? But the thing is, Putin doesn't want to be saved. By delaying political and sanctions support for Ukraine, as well as weapons and so on and so forth.
We've been witnessing this in this large-scale specific war since 2022. The Kharkiv operation, the Kherson operation, when a group of more than 20,000 enemy troops with heavy weaponry and everything else was blockaded on our right bank from Kherson. In other words, there was an opportunity. However, the Russians threatened to use tactical nuclear weapons. So the Americans felt pressure on Ukraine, and the entire personnel of that group, along with their equipment, crossed the Dnipro without any interference. In other words, if they had stayed, they would have remained in the Dnipro. But in this case, they all got out completely unharmed. 2 weeks later, they were already being used over there in the Izium area. That's the kind of approach it was. So in every case, the Americans, both the previous administration and the current one, acted in a way to make sure Ukraine would not win outright. Now, regarding the question of whether they'll always be with us, the previous ones will stick it out to the end. But what exactly to the end means is something we need to figure out. We see that when there's no administration, you can't find the kind of support the Americans promised us. But with Trump, things are happening completely differently. But one way or another, they continue in this manner, even though Trump says that everything Biden did was bad. In this particular approach, unfortunately, the Trump administration continues the same bad policy.
Well, as they say, we have our own work to do. Over these 3.5 years, we finally realized, though honestly, we realized it a bit too late, right? Because, we wanted flamingos in a country that was launching its own rockets into space. It seems to me that flamingos could have appeared a bit earlier. But we also understand the difficulties in production, probably.
Here, the strategically important answer is that the fundamental security of one's own sovereign state must always be the absolute top priority for any nation or country. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, we thought that, basically from being in first place, as it was in the Union, and it really was, I served in that army for 20 years, so I understand this. And for 20 long and challenging years now, in our independent and sovereign Ukraine, unfortunately, these critical issues have been consistently pushed to the background and neglected by the state, and now, regrettably, we are paying a very heavy price for this oversight with the precious lives and invaluable health of our brave defenders.
Unfortunately. Igor Alexandrovich, let's talk about the situation at the front, because some foreign analysts are already declaring the complete failure of Putin's much publicized so-called summer offensive. But at the same time, President Zelensky comes out and says that the situation is in fact difficult and on several fronts at once. According to the Ukrainian president, the most difficult situation is in the Pokrovsk direction. There, the occupiers have amassed more than 100,000 troops and are preparing new offensive actions. And the situation is serious in the Zaporizhzhia direction. How do you assess, in general, the analysis that the Russians have already run out of steam with this summer offensive? Is that really the case? And how dangerous is the most difficult, the hottest front right now? How dangerous is the situation there at the moment?
From the Austrian turnip. We've heard these kinds of tendentious statements more than once. He tries to be objective, but when it comes to assessing the real situation and presenting future prospects, he does it differently each time, including in this way. In reality, the situation at the front is difficult. The priority is the fighting for Putin's objectives, because their plan is to capture 4 regions. They have taken Luhansk, and there is intense fighting in the Donetsk region, as we can see. And now, after what happened a week ago, namely the reinforcement of resources, primarily with personnel in the Pokrovsk and Zaporizhzhia directions. In Pokrovsk, as we know, the raids in Dobropilya are very tough, and the situation there is still not fully stabilized. So there are signs that, so to speak, things are not yet in their final state there. In addition, on the ground, this means advancing into the Dnipropetrovsk region, where fighting is already taking place for 2 or 3 settlements on Dnipropetrovsk territory. Furthermore, in Lyman, the enemy is making significant advances. And here, Lyman, if you look at the map, this is the direction from the northeast toward Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, which are our most fortified, and important areas. So here, on one hand, they are advancing from the south, Kostiantynivka, Druzhkivka, moving toward Kramatorsk and Sloviansk from the south, and from the northeast, it's Liman and Siversk. And unfortunately, the fighting has advanced in the Serebryansky forestry area, generally in the direction of Lyman, Yampol, and Lyman. And here, their advance is taking place with all the resulting threats, so far at the tactical level, but it is happening. That's the situation. And in Zaporizhzhia, the situation has worsened after their reinforcements arrived. They captured Kamyansky and are moving north. They have already reached Stepnohirsk and are trying to outflank it, and that's just 25 kilometers from Zaporizhzhia. There's a road from Dnipro, from Stepnohirsk to Zaporizhzhia. They like to use it and carry out offensive actions right along the roads. So the situation there has also become more complicated. On the one hand, the situation at the front is difficult. And now if we take into account that various intelligence agencies, including our commander-in-chief, General Syrskyi, have said that somewhere deep inside Russia, reserve divisions are being formed, about 12 in total, with 2 already formed. So there is a prospect of them being reinforced. This is for the second stage of the campaign in the war of 2025. And therefore, if we also take these prospects into account, it's hard to say that everything here has failed. Their plans, of course, the Russian plans have been disrupted, both in terms of timing and in what they wanted to capture. Putin isn't bargaining at night for nothing, give up Dnipro. Well, they also entered Dnipro and would like to have it. There are ongoing battles. Give up Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, because these are our heavily fortified areas, and that's why they understand they'll lose a lot of men fighting for, so to speak, these regions of ours. No one is planning to just give them up, and that's why such negotiations are happening. This in itself shows that they never do anything just like that. They do things to achieve and implement their plans, and that's obvious. And that's the situation. Massive airstrikes, and on the front lines, things are like this. So where are all those failed Russian offensives? Well, I'd like to see them, but I'm not really seeing that happen.
Understood. So once again, we come back to the point that you have to nip it in the bud, yes, and strike at the rear. These strikes need to be intensified today, made more frequent and more effective. Thank you so much, Igor Alexandrovich, for taking the time to share your analysis with us. Let me remind our viewers that today, my questions were answered by Igor Alexandrovich Romanenko, retired Lieutenant General, a well-known military expert in Ukraine, and former Deputy Chief of the General Staff from 2006 to 2010. Thank you, and until we meet again.
Thank you very much.